a desperate rancher drowning in debt, a mysterious woman with nowhere to go, and one small act of kindness that changed everything. Silas Montgomery thought he was saving a stranger from the cold, but he had no idea she carried secrets tied to the very land he was fighting to protect. As winter closed in across Texas, trust would be tested, hearts would break, and two lonely souls would discover that redemption often arrives when we least expect it. This story will stay with you long after the final word.
The wind in Oak Creek didn't blow, it scraped. Silas Montgomery felt it in his bones. October in Texas was supposed to bring relief. Instead, it just brought cold dust. He hit a rusted nail with his hammer. The iron bent against the tough wood of the fence post. He cursed under his breath, tossed the nail into the dirt. 8 weeks. That was all Thaddeus Sterling had given him. 8 weeks to find $2,400. The debt wasn't even his. It belonged to his late brother. But Silas had made a promise on a dying man's bed, and a Pinkerton man, even a retired one, didn't break his word. He needed supplies. He needed a miracle. He mounted his horse and headed into town. The general store had a crowd out front. Too early for a crowd. Silas pulled his horse to a stop. He stepped down. The dust settled around his boots. Then he heard it. A voice, sharp, loud, and dripping with venom. Margaret Vance. She stood on the wooden porch of the store, waving a piece of white lace in the brisk air, a woman's undergarment. Silas pushed his way through the onlookers. Then he saw her, Eleanor. She stood at the bottom of the steps. She didn't have a coat. She wore a crude, heavy dress made out of stitched-together grain sacks. The brutal morning wind whipped at the rough fabric. She didn't shiver. She didn't cry. She just stood there, her spine straight as an iron rod. She was staring right past the crowd, right at the horizon. Margaret called out another item. One wool winter coat. Practically new. Do I hear $2? The crowd murmured. A few men chuckled. Silas felt a cold knot pull tight in his gut. He knew cruelty. He'd seen the worst of men back in Denver. He'd seen the blood of the war. But this was a different kind of ugly. This was legal, polite society cruelty. Margaret was stripping the girl of her belongings to settle a family debt, but she was really trying to strip her of her soul. Silas didn't think. He just walked up the wooden steps. He unbuttoned his heavy, fleece-lined sheepskin coat. It was warm. It smelled like cedar and worn leather. He took it off and draped it firmly over Eleanor's trembling shoulders. The crowd went dead quiet. Margaret stopped mid-sentence, her mouth hanging open. Silas turned his back to Eleanor. He looked right at Margaret. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. A person's dignity isn't woven into the fabric they wear, Silas said. His voice cut through the cold morning air, loud enough for every soul in that plaza to hear. It is in how they stand when the world tries to break them. You can auction her clothes, Margaret. You can sell every last thread. But you cannot put a price tag on her humanity. And you have no right to strip anyone of their basic human rights, no matter what a bank ledger says. Margaret flushed red. The crowd shifted, suddenly looking down at their boots. Ashamed, Silas turned around. He looked at Eleanor. Up close, her eyes were sharp, intelligent, fierce. I have a ranch, Silas told her. It needs a steady hand. I'm offering you a position. $4 a month. Room and board included. He paused. He let the words settle between them. It's a pittance, Silas continued, his voice softer now, meant only for her. I know that, but on my land, you are treated as a human being, not property. Nobody's dignity is for sale out there. You have my word on that. Eleanor looked at him. She pulled the sheepskin coat a little tighter around her neck. I accept, she said. No hesitation, no begging. Just a deal struck in the dirt. Night fell hard and heavy on the Montgomery ranch. Silas sat by the dying fire in the kitchen. His ledger lay open on the wooden table. The numbers blurred together in the lamplight. Down the hall, the door to the spare room was shut. Eleanor was asleep. Silas tapped his pen against the paper. He couldn't shake the thought. $4. Any fool from here to Austin knew that was a starvation wage, an absolute insult of a paycheck. But she didn't blink. She didn't try to haggle for 5 or 6. She just said yes. When she spoke, she sounded educated, refined, like a woman who knew exactly what her time was worth. So why take the $4? The old Pinkerton itch started at the base of his skull. The one that told him a puzzle was missing a piece. People only took a raw deal when they were playing a longer game. She wasn't just desperate. She wanted something. Something out here, on this specific patch of dry dirt. Something worth a whole lot more than pride or money. Silas closed the ledger. He stared at the glowing embers in the hearth. He was going to find out what she was hiding, and he prayed to God it wouldn't ruin them both. Morning came fast. It always did on the ranch. Silas woke before the sun. The floorboards were freezing. He swung his legs out of bed, pulled on his boots, walked out to the kitchen, expecting the usual chill, the dark, the stale smell of yesterday's coffee. It was dark. A small fire cracked in the hearth, not a roaring bacheloress fire that burned out in 20 minutes. A steady, measured flame. Eleanor stood by the stove. She was boiling water. She wore his sheepskin coat. It was massive on her. The hem hung down to her shins. The sleeves were rolled up 3 times, just so her hands could reach the cast-iron skillet. She looked ridiculous. She looked like she belonged. Silas stopped in the doorway. He just watched her. She didn't jump. She just turned her head, acknowledged him with a slight nod. "Coffee's almost ready," she said. "Didn't expect you up this early," Silas replied. His voice was gravelly from sleep. "Animals don't care what time the sun comes up." She turned back to the stove. That was the first rule they established. No useless chatter in the morning. Silas appreciated that. He poured a cup of black coffee, walked out to the porch. The air was sharp. He looked out over the dry Texas dirt. He had a stranger in his house. A woman who had just lost everything. Yet, she wasn't crying. She was making breakfast. The next few days settled into a strange rhythm. A silent negotiation of space. Silas was a man used to living alone. Rough edges, dirty boots, leaving tools wherever they fell. Eleanor was different. She had an order to her. A quiet, educated person. Silas watched it happen. First, it was the grain sack in the barn. Silas always left it open, easy to scoop. Tuesday morning, he found it tied shut, pulled tight with a piece of twine, kept the mice out. He didn't say a word, but he never left it open again. Next, it was his work shirts. He usually washed them in the horse trough, beat them dry on a rock, left them stiff as cardboard. Wednesday, he found them draped over the porch rail, smelling like lye, soap, and fresh air. Softened. He didn't thank her. He just started leaving his dirty shirts in a neat pile by the wash bin. She never asked for a different dress. She just kept wearing that grain sack underneath his big sheepskin coat. She worked the garden. She fed the chickens. She hauled water. Every task was done with her back straight. It drove Silas crazy. Not the work, the silence, the pure, unbroken pride of it. Friday night, dinner. They sat across from each other at the small wooden table. Venison stew, hardtack. The only sound was the clinking of tin spoons against clay bowls. Silas couldn't take it anymore. He set his spoon down. "Why didn't you go to the sheriff?" he asked. Eleanor stopped eating. She didn't look up right away. "About the auction?" Silas pressed. "Margaret sold your clothes, your personal property. She claimed it was for a family debt, But a sheriff could have looked into the ledgers, halted the sale. You didn't even try to fight it legally. Eleanor set her spoon down. Slowly, she looked up. Her eyes met his across the dim lantern light. Fight it legally, she repeated. Her voice wasn't angry. It was heavy, tired of the world's ignorance. Yes, Silas said. The law is there for a reason. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. She looked him dead in the eye. Mr. Montgomery, she said, her voice clear and ringing in the quiet room. I need you to understand something. A society where a woman's property can be legally stripped away simply because she lacks a husband to claim ownership is not justice. It is lawful captivity. Silas stared at her. The words hit him like a physical blow. She wasn't done. She made sure he heard every syllable. You tell me to go to the sheriff, she continued, stating the absolute truth of the matter. The sheriff enforces the law, and the law says an unmarried woman is a liability. Margaret knew that. She knew no court in this county would freeze an estate sale on the word of a spinster daughter. I will not beg for pity from a system designed to dismiss my existence. True equality means I have the right to own my life without a man co-signing for it. Until the law recognizes that, the law is not my friend. Silas didn't have an answer. He had spent 13 years as a Pinkerton detective. He had chased outlaws. He had studied the law, but he had never looked at it from where she was sitting. He picked up his spoon. He looked down at his stew. I reckon you're right, he said quietly. He didn't offer pity. She didn't want it. But from that night on, Silas didn't just see a woman he had rescued. He saw a mind that was sharper than his own. And he realized that underneath that oversized coat, she was fighting a war he was only just beginning to understand. Trouble never rode in quietly. It usually arrived in a polished black buggy. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The dust cloud on the southern trail announced him 10 minutes before he arrived. Thaddeus Sterling. Silas was out by the corral. He saw the buggy. He felt his jaw tighten. He drove his pitchfork into the dirt, left it there. Sterling pulled up to the main house. The horses were fine blood, too fine for Oak Creek. Sterling stepped down. He was a man of 52, tailored suit. Gold pocket watch chain gleaming in the autumn sun. He smelled like bay rum and compound interest. Silas, Sterling said. Not a greeting, a summons. Thaddeus. Silas didn't step forward to shake his hand. Sterling looked around the yard. His eyes swept over the peeling paint on the barn, the rusted plow. Place is looking tired, Silas. Place is working, Silas countered. What do you want? Sterling sighed. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his breast pocket. He didn't open it. He just held it. We need to talk about the note, Sterling said. Your brother's note. I have 8 weeks, Silas said. His voice was low, dangerous. You do, Sterling agreed. Legally, but let's be pragmatic. 2400. Have it. You aren't going to have it. Cattle prices are down. The winter is going to be brutal. I'll have the money. Sterling smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. The Continental Railroad Company is surveying the county next month. They need a straight line through this valley. Your eastern border, the creek. It's the only natural water source for a steam engine for 40 miles. Silas felt the blood rush to his ears. The land isn't for sale. Everything is for sale, Silas, especially when the bank holds the deed. If you default in 8 weeks, I foreclose. I sell to the railroad. I recoup the bank's losses. I'm telling you this as a courtesy. Start packing up. Don't make this ugly. Sterling tipped his hat. He climbed back into his buggy. He drove away, leaving a trail of suffocating dust. Silas stood frozen. $2,400. It might as well be $1 million. He looked at the dirt. He felt like he was drowning in it. He turned around. Eleanor was standing on the porch. She had a basket of wet laundry in her arms. She had heard every word. Silas knew she had. The porch was close enough. He expected her to look scared, to realize she had hitched her wagon to a sinking ship. She didn't. She just set the basket down. "We need flour," she said evenly, "and salt. If we are going to cure the winter meat, we need salt." Silas stared at her. "Did you hear him?" "I heard a man wearing a suit he didn't sew, demanding money he didn't earn," Eleanor said. "We still need salt." Silas let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He walked to the barn to hitch the wagon. They drove into town together. Sunday afternoon. The town square was busier than usual. Folks leaving church, milling about. Silas pulled the wagon up in front of the general store. He tied off the horses. Eleanor climbed down. She was still wearing his sheepskin coat. It was her armor. They walked onto the wooden boardwalk. "Well, isn't this a touching picture?" The voice was a whip crack. Silas stopped. Eleanor stopped. Margaret Vance stepped out of the millinery shop. She wore a dark blue velvet dress. A hat with a pheasant feather. She looked wealthy, untouchable. A few townspeople stopped walking. They turned to watch. In Oak Creek, gossip was the only free entertainment. Margaret looked Eleanor up and down. Her eyes lingered on the oversized, scuffed leather coat. A sneer twisted her lips. "Look at you," Margaret said. Her voice carried. She wanted an audience, wearing a man's cast-offs, living under his roof, unchaperoned. "I suppose when a woman has no morals left, she has to trade whatever she can to keep a roof over her head." Silas felt his hand drop toward the colt on his hip. It was pure instinct. Eleanor put a hand on his arm, just a touch, but it stopped him cold. She stepped past him. She walked right up to Margaret. She didn't shrink. She didn't lower her eyes. "You think you shamed me, Margaret," Eleanor said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was incredibly clear. "You think taking my dresses took my worth." Margaret scoffed. "You are a beggar living with a bankrupt cowboy. You have no worth." Eleanor shook her head slowly. She spoke, and she made sure every person on that boardwalk heard the lesson. "You measure human worth in dollar bills and bank ledgers, Margaret," Eleanor stated. "You think a velvet dress makes you decent, but human decency is not something you can buy or inherit. It is what Mr. Montgomery showed me when I had absolutely nothing. That compassion is worth more than the entire estate you are desperately clinging to." She paused. "Let the truth of it hang in the air. True value is found in how we treat the vulnerable," Eleanor continued, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. "When you stripped me of my belongings, you only revealed your own poverty of spirit. My conscience is clean. Can you say the same?" Margaret's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The smugness vanished, replaced by a sudden ugly flush of embarrassment. The crowd was dead silent. Nobody was laughing now. Eleanor turned her back on her stepmother. She walked into the general store. Silas stood there for a second. He looked at Margaret. Then he looked at the swinging doors of the store. He didn't have $2,400. He had a ruined farm and a ghost of a chance. But right then, walking into that store after her, Silas Montgomery felt like the richest man in Texas. The dust in the Montgomery house had a way of settling heavy. It coated the floorboards. It frosted the windows. And it covered the small, iron-banded lockbox Silas pulled from beneath his late brother S. bed. Silas wiped the lid with his sleeve. He carried the heavy box to the kitchen table. He needed the deed. He needed the original survey maps. If Thaddeus Sterling was threatening to sell the eastern border to the railroad, Silas needed to know exactly where that border began and ended. He slid the key into the lock. It clicked, a sharp, loud sound in the empty house. Eleanor was outside. He could see her through the kitchen window. She was down by the creek, hauling water for the horses. She moved with a steady, practiced rhythm. She didn't look like a wealthy landowner's daughter anymore. She looked like the land itself, tough, weathered, enduring. Silas opened the box. It smelled like dry paper and old tobacco, Thomas S. smell. Silas sifted through the stacks, promissory notes, receipts for feed, a faded photograph of their mother. Then he found a bundle tied with black ribbon. Silas untied it. He unfolded the top paper. It wasn't a deed. It was a letter, dated March 1876. Over 2 years ago. The handwriting was elegant, sharp angles, bold ink. Silas looked at the signature at the bottom. William Vance, Eleanor's father. Silas frowned. He smoothed the letter flat on the table. He started to read. To Thomas Montgomery, I write to you as a neighbor. I wish to purchase the 20 acres of your eastern border, the strip that encompasses the creek. I will pay above market value. I am a sick man, Thomas. My heart is failing. I need to leave a specific piece of land with guaranteed water rights to my biological daughter, Eleanor. I need to leave her something that cannot be contested, something of her own. Name your price. Silas stopped reading. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. He looked back out the window. Eleanor was still by the creek, the eastern border, the exact piece of land her father had tried to buy. Thomas hadn't sold it. Thomas had died 2 months after that letter was written. But Eleanor was here, working for $4 a month, sleeping under his roof, mending his shirts. Silas felt a cold prickle at the back of his neck. 13 years working for the Pinkerton Agency. 13 years of hunting liars, cheats, and thieves. He knew the feeling of being played. He folded the letter. He slipped it into his pocket. He needed to go to town. The mail stage came on Thursdays. He needed fresh air. He needed to clear his head. The ride to Oak Creek was a blur. Silas didn't feel the cold wind. He only felt the burn of the betrayal. She wasn't a desperate woman seeking refuge. She was a woman on a mission. She had planted herself on the exact dirt she wanted to own. He tied his horse outside the post office. The postmaster, a frail man named Higgins, handed him a small stack of envelopes. Got one in there that got chewed up in the mailbag. Higgins apologized. Looks like it's for the missus staying out at your place. Address got smudged, but it says Montgomery Ranch. Silas took the stack. He walked out to the boardwalk. He flipped through the envelopes. He found the damaged one. The flap was torn halfway open. The return address was stamped in crisp black ink. Crawford and Sons, attorneys at law, Austin, Texas. Addressed to Eleanor Vance, care of the Montgomery Ranch. Silas didn't mean to pry. He told himself that. But the envelope was already torn, and his instincts were screaming. He slid the heavy parchment out, just far enough to read the top paragraph. Dear Miss Vance, we confirm receipt of your correspondence. Please be advised that your personal account containing $200 remains frozen, pending the outcome of the probate dispute, filed by Margaret Vance. We expect a ruling in 6 to 8 weeks. Remain patient. Silas stopped breathing. $1,200. A working cowboy made $30 a month. $1,200 was a fortune. It was half his entire debt to the bank. He shoved the letter back into the torn envelope. He gripped the wooden rail of the boardwalk. His knuckles turned white. She had money. She had lawyers in Austin. She had a plan. And she had sat at his table, eating his hardtack, letting him think he was saving her, letting him play the hero. She had looked him in the eye and talked about justice and survival, while sitting on a secret that could buy his ranch twice over. Silas climbed onto his horse. The ride back was slow. The anger settled deep into his bones. It turned into something hard, something frozen. It was the same mistake he had made in Denver, trusting the wrong face, believing the story instead of the facts. He walked into the kitchen. The sun was setting. The room was cast in long, dark shadows. Eleanor was at the stove. She turned around. She held a plate of warm biscuits. "You're back late," she said. Silas walked to the table. He tossed the stack of mail down. The torn envelope from Austin sat right on top. He didn't yell. He didn't slam his fists. That wasn't his way. His voice was dead flat. "Mail came," he said. Eleanor walked over. She looked at the stack. She saw the seal from the Austin law firm. She froze, just for a second. But Silas saw it. The slight hesitation, the tightening of her jaw. She picked up the envelope. She didn't open it. She didn't look at him. "Thank you," she said softly. Silas stood there. He waited for her to explain, to offer a single word of truth. She said nothing. She put the letter in her apron pocket. Silas looked at her. He felt a profound, heavy exhaustion. He spoke, making sure the words carried the full weight of his realization. "True trust requires total transparency," Silas stated. The words were rigid, laying out the absolute law of his conscience. You cannot build a partnership on half-truths. When a person hides their motives, they aren't protecting themselves. They are manipulating the people around them. Without absolute honesty, any relationship is just a lie waiting to be discovered. Eleanor flinched. The words hit their mark. She looked up at him. Her eyes were wide. She opened her mouth to speak. Silas didn't give her the chance. He turned on his heel. "I'm eating in the barn tonight," he said. He walked out. He pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind him. It clicked into the frame, a sharp, loud sound in the dying light. The silence returned to the Montgomery ranch, but this time, it wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of a bridge burning down. The cold didn't creep in. It hit like a hammer. A Texas norther blew down from the plains 2 days later. The sky turned the color of bruised iron. The wind howled through the cracks in the barn. It carried a biting, wet sleet that froze the ground solid. They had to move the cattle. It wasn't a massive herd, just 40 head, but they were Silas. His only chance to make a dent in the debt. He had to drive them to the railhead in Abilene, a 2-day push. He didn't ask Eleanor to come. He couldn't afford to hire a drover, so he planned to do it alone. He saddled his horse in the freezing dark. He led the gelding out of the barn. Eleanor was waiting by the corral. She was mounted on the old roan mare. She wore his sheepskin coat. Her face was wrapped in a woolen scarf. Only her eyes were visible. They were sharp, determined. Silas stopped. "Go back inside. You'll freeze. You can't push 40 head alone in this weather," she said. Her voice was muffled by the scarf, but it didn't waver. "You'll lose half of them to the brush. I don't need your help." "I don't care what you need," Eleanor replied. She nudged her horse forward. "You pay me $4 a month to work this ranch. I am working." Silas glared at her. The anger from the letters was still a hard knot in his chest. But he looked at the sky. He looked at the restless cattle. He knew she was right. "Stay on the left flank," he ordered. "Keep them moving. If you fall behind, I am not stopping." She nodded once. The drive was brutal. The wind cut through denim and leather. The sleet stung their faces like tiny needles. They rode for hours without speaking. The only sounds were the cracking of leather, the lowing of the miserable cattle, and the relentless howl of the wind. Silas watched her out of the corner of his eye. She didn't complain. She didn't ask to stop. When a calf broke from the herd, she spurred her horse into the freezing brush and chased it back. She rode hard. She rode like she had something to prove. The cold forced them into a silent truce. The elements didn't care about frozen bank accounts or hidden agendas. Survival required teamwork. If she missed a stray on the left, Silas had to cover it. If he lost the pace in the front, she pushed them from behind. They worked as one unit. Flawless, unspoken. They reached the Abilene stockyards on the evening of the second day. The town smelled of manure, coal smoke, and cheap whiskey. Silas penned the cattle. He found the buyer, a stout man with a thick mustache and a ledger. They'd stood by the fence in the freezing rain. "They're thin," the buyer said. He spat tobacco juice into the mud. Winter hit them hard. "Prices are down. Montgomery, Chicago isn't paying what they did in the spring." "They're healthy," Silas argued. His voice was hoarse. "I need top dollar. I can give you $380 for the lot," the buyer said. "Take it or leave it." Silas felt his stomach drop. 380. He needed 400 just to make the interest payment for Thaddeus Sterling. He still owed 2,000 more on the principal. 380 wasn't a dent. It was a drop in a bottomless bucket. He looked at the buyer. He looked at the cattle he had spent the last year keeping alive. "I'll take it," Silas said. The words tasted like ash. He collected the cash. He walked back to the livery stable, where they had left the wagon for the ride home. Eleanor was waiting. She had bought hot coffee and a loaf of bread. She handed him a tin cup. Silas took it. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, from the absolute, crushing weight of failure. He sat down on a wooden crate. He stared at the dirt floor of the stable. He pulled the wad of bills from his pocket. He just looked at it. He had lost. He had broken his promise to his dying brother. He was going to lose the ranch. He was going to lose the land. Everything he had bled for over the last 4 years was gone. Eleanor didn't ask how much he got. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just sat down on the crate next to him. They sat there for 20 minutes. The rain pounded on the tin roof of the stable. She didn't offer empty pity. She just offered her presence, a warm body in a freezing room. She sat close enough that their shoulders brushed. Finally, Silas put the money away. He stood up. "Let's go home," he said. They hitched the wagon. Silas drove. The storm had broken, leaving behind a bitter, clear cold. The stars were violently bright. Halfway back to Oak Creek, Silas spoke. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the dark road. "I used to think if I fought hard enough, I could save anything," Silas said. The words felt torn from his throat. "Back in the agency, I thought I could outsmart the bad hands, outwork the bad luck. But out here, you can do everything right. You can wake up before the sun. You can break your back. You can bleed into the dirt. And the wind just blows it all away. Some wounds just can't be stitched shut." He gripped the reins tighter. "I'm going to lose the ranch, Eleanor. Sterling is going to take it." Eleanor looked at him. She saw the broken man underneath the tough hide. She reached into her canvas satchel. She pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. She placed it on the wooden bench between them. "What is this?" Silas asked. Eleanor turned to face him. Her voice was incredibly gentle, but it carried a fierce, undeniable strength. "Healing isn't about hiding the scars, Silas," Eleanor stated clearly, laying out the truth he needed to hear. "It is about having the courage to lean on someone else when your own legs give out. We are taught that independence means suffering in silence, that asking for help is a weakness. But true strength is found in mutual support. A community, a partnership, survives only when we are willing to carry each other's burdens." She tapped the notebook. "I didn't just mend your shirts for the last month," she said. "I looked at your soil. I looked at the weather patterns. I looked at the southern pasture you aren't using. This is a crop rotation and winter wheat plan. It won't pay the whole debt today, but it will double your yield by spring. It is enough to present to a legitimate bank in Austin, enough to get a loan to pay off Sterling completely. Silas stared at the book. Then he looked at her. Why? He asked. Why are you doing this? You have your own money. You have your own land to fight for. Eleanor looked out at the dark prairie. Because you put your coat around my shoulders when the rest of the world was perfectly happy to let me freeze, she said quietly. Now, let me help you carry the weight. Silas didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He reached down and picked up the ledger. He held it tight in his gloved hand. The wind was still blowing. The air was still freezing. But for the first time in years, Silas Montgomery didn't feel like he was riding into the dark alone. Oak Creek was a small town. Small towns didn't have secrets. They had ammunition. Silas felt it the moment he rode in for supplies. The winter air was still biting, but the frost on the boardwalk wasn't half as cold as the stairs. He tied his horse outside the mercantile. Two men from the livery stable were smoking on the corner. They stopped talking when Silas stepped down. They looked. They spat. They looked away. Inside the store, it was worse. Mrs. Gable was pricing flour. She saw Silas. She quickly turned her back, pretending to be utterly fascinated by a row of canned peaches. Silas ignored it. He was a former Pinkerton. He was used to being the most unpopular man in a room. He walked to the counter, ordered his salt, a sack of coffee, and a box of nails. He was carrying the supplies to his wagon when Abigail Higgins stepped out of the post office. Abigail was 60 years old. She was the postmaster's wife, the head of the church auxiliary, and the unofficial moral compass of Oak Creek. She didn't scowl at Silas. She looked at him with profound, heavy pity. That was infinitely worse. Silas Montgomery, she said. Silas stopped. He held the wooden crate against his chest. Mrs. Higgins. Put that box in your wagon and step over here, she instructed. Not a request, a command. Silas did as he was told. He walked back to the wooden awning. The wind whipped down the dirt street, kicking up dust. Abigail looked him up and down. Your brother Thomas was a good man, a God-fearing man. He was, Silas agreed. His jaw tightened. He knew exactly where this was going. And I always believed you had a decent core, despite your violent profession in the past, Abigail continued. She pulled her woolen shawl tighter. But this town has rules, Silas. Unspoken rules of decency. You have a young, unmarried woman living under your roof, alone, out there on the prairie. She works for me. She is a ranch hand. Abigail sighed. A long, weary sound. Do you think anyone in this town believes that? A gentleman does not keep a woman in his cabin. It's ruining her, Silas. Margaret Vance is already spreading poison, saying the girl traded her virtue for a warm bed. You are letting her reputation be dragged through the mud. Margaret Vance is a liar, Silas said. His voice was dangerously low. Margaret Vance is respected, Abigail countered smoothly, and perception is reality in a place like this. If you care for that girl's soul, or her future, you will bring her into town. Put her up at Mrs. Davis's boarding house. Pay her wage, but do not keep her under your roof. If you don't, no decent family will ever look her in the eye again. Abigail didn't wait for an answer. She turned and walked back into the post office. Silas stood on the boardwalk. The wind bit through his denim jacket. He looked out toward the horizon, toward his ranch. He felt a sickening knot in his stomach, not out of guilt, out of realization. He had wrapped his coat around Eleanor to protect her from the cold. He had brought her to the ranch to protect her from the streets. But his protection was a double-edged sword. By keeping her close, he was handing the town the very knife they were using to cut her down. The ride home was agonizingly slow. The winter wheat plan Eleanor had drawn up was brilliant. It gave him hope. It gave them a fighting chance against Thaddeus Sterling. But what good was saving the dirt if it cost Eleanor her name? He pulled the wagon into the yard. The sun was dipping low. The sky was bleeding orange and purple. Eleanor came out of the barn. She carried a pitchfork. Her face was smudged with dust, and she was wearing his oversized coat. She looked tired. She looked beautiful. Silas tied off the horses. He didn't unload the wagon. He walked straight up to the porch. He sat down on the wooden steps. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. Eleanor saw his face. She leaned the pitchfork against the post. She walked over and stood at the bottom of the steps. "What happened?" she asked. Silas looked at his dusty boots. He didn't want to say the words. He didn't want to bring the town filth onto his porch. But he had promised her honesty. "I talked to Abigail Higgins in town," Silas began. His voice was rough. "Or rather, she talked to me." Eleanor didn't flinch. She just waited. "The town is talking, Eleanor," Silas said, finally looking up at her. "Margaret has them whipped up. They re-saying things. Ugly things. About us living out here alone. Abigail said if I cared about your future, I'd move you into Mrs. Davis's boarding house in town. Keep you away from here. Keep you respectable." He paused. He hated the taste of the words. "I can pay for the room," Silas offered, softly. "It's only right. I didn't mean to drag you into my mud." Eleanor stood perfectly still. The wind caught the edge of her skirt. She looked out at the rolling plains, then back to Silas. Her eyes were not scared. They were blazing. She walked up the steps. She sat down right next to him. "Look at me, Silas," she said. He turned his head. "You think a room in town will save my honor?" Eleanor asked. Her voice was remarkably calm, but it carried a weight that demanded absolute attention. "It will stop the whispers," Silas said. "No, it won't," Eleanor replied. She sat up straighter. She looked him dead in the eye, and she made sure he heard every single word of the lesson she was about to impart. "My honor does not depend on the wagging tongues of hypocrites," Eleanor stated clearly, her voice cutting through the evening wind. "Those people in town, they stood on the boardwalk and watched my stepmother sell the very shoes off my feet. They did nothing. They did not offer me a bed. They did not offer me a coat. You did. And now they want to dictate how I survive?" Silas opened his mouth, but she held up a hand. "Silas, listen to me," she continued, her tone shifting to a profound educational clarity. "This isn't just about gossip. This is about power. Society uses reputation as a leash to control women. They are telling me that I cannot work a job, that I cannot share a roof with an honorable man, simply because I am an unmarried woman. If I retreat to that boarding house because of their prejudice, I am accepting their rules." She took a breath. The fire in her eyes was magnificent. "If I run away to protect my reputation, I am teaching the next generation of women that their right to exist in the world requires a man's permission," Eleanor declared. "I am validating the idea that a woman's worth is destroyed the moment she steps out of the boundaries society drew for her. I will not do it. My dignity is mine. I earn it by the work of my hands and the truth in my heart, not by hiding from small-minded people." Silas sat there, paralyzed. He had spent his whole life fighting men with guns. He had never met anyone who fought with such pure, unshakable conviction. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the grit. He saw the brilliant mind. He saw a woman who refused to be a victim of a corrupt system. They'll make it hard for you," Silas warned quietly. "They'll cut you dead in the street." "Let them," Eleanor said. She reached out. She placed her hand over his. Her grip was firm. calloused from the ranch work. We have a winter wheat crop to plant. We have a bank note to pay. I am not leaving this ranch, Silas Montgomery, unless you are firing me. Silas looked down at her hand, covering his. The warmth of it seeped through the freezing air. He slowly turned his hand over. He laced his fingers through hers, just for a second. A silent, unbreakable pact. You're not fired, he said. Eleanor gave a small, fierce nod. She let go of his hand, stood up, and went inside to start the fire. Silas remained on the porch. The sun was gone now. The stars were beginning to burn through the black sky. He thought about what she had said, about power, about not accepting the rules of a broken system, about not hiding out of fear of what others might think. He thought about the crushing debt hanging over his head. Thaddeus Sterling, the $2,400. For 4 years, Silas had carried that burden alone. He hadn't asked for help. He hadn't reached out to his old Pinkerton contacts. He told himself it was about honor. He told himself a real man solved his own problems, paid his own debts. But sitting there in the dark, listening to the clatter of cast iron from the kitchen, Silas realized the ugly truth. It wasn't honor, it was pride. Toxic, stubborn pride. The exact same kind of fear Eleanor had just refused to bow to. He was terrified of looking weak. Terrified of admitting he couldn't hold his brother's ranch together by himself. Eleanor had swallowed her pride to survive. She had taken a $4 wage and worn a grain sack because it was what she had to do to fight her war. It was time for Silas to fight his. He stood up. He walked into the house. The kitchen was warm. The smell of burning cedar filled the air. He didn't go to the stove. He went straight to the small writing desk in the corner of the living room. He lit a kerosene lantern. He pulled out a sheet of heavy paper. He dipped his pen in the inkwell. He hadn't written to Jake Mercer in 3 years. Jake was a good man, a former Pinkerton who had struck it rich running a private security firm up in Denver. Jake owed Silas his life after a shootout in '73. Jake had told him, if you ever need a steak, Montgomery, you just say the word. Silas had never said the word, because saying the word meant admitting defeat. He held the pen over the paper. The ink threatened to drip. He thought about Eleanor. True strength is found in mutual support. That's what she had told him on the freezing ride back from Abilene. Silas brought the pen down. Jake, I hope this letter finds you well. I am writing to collect on that old favor. I am backed into a corner with the bank. A man named Thaddeus Sterling is trying to pull the land out from under me. I have a solid plan for the spring harvest. I have the land. But I need a bridge loan to survive the winter and pay off the immediate interest. Silas paused. He looked at the words. They felt strangely liberating. He wasn't bleeding out. He was just reloading. He continued writing, making sure the realization in his heart made it onto the page. I used to believe that asking for help was a sign of weakness. I thought a man was supposed to carry the whole world on his own back. But I was wrong. Refusing to ask for help when the people you care about are on the line isn't strength. It's just foolish pride. I need a $300 loan, Jake. I will pay it back with interest by June. Let me know if you can back my play. Yours, Silas. He signed his name. He folded the paper. He sealed it in an envelope. He stood up from the desk. Eleanor was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. She had a dishcloth in her hand. She looked at the sealed letter in his grip. Writing a letter? She asked softly. Silas looked at the envelope. Then he looked at her. Yeah, Silas said. The heavy weight in his chest felt remarkably lighter. I am. He walked over to her. He stopped just a foot away. You were right, Eleanor, Silas said, looking directly into her eyes. About all of it. A person doesn't survive out here by standing alone in a storm and pretending they aren't cold. You survive by building a fire together. He placed the letter on the table. I'm asking a friend for a loan, Silas told her. Eleanor looked at the letter. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face. It reached her eyes. It was the first time Silas had seen her truly smile since the day she arrived. It was a beautiful, devastating thing. That's a good plan, Mr. Montgomery, she said softly. It's Silas, he corrected her. If we're going to fight the whole town and the bank, you might as well use my given name. Eleanor's smile widened. Just a fraction. Silas, she said. The name sounded perfect on her lips. They stood there for a long moment. The wind howled outside. The town of Oak Creek was miles away, spinning its webs of gossip and judgment. But inside that small, drafty cabin, the air was warm, and for the first time, Silas felt like the foundation beneath his feet was finally made of stone instead of dust. The rider came at high noon. It was a young boy from town. He rode a sway-back dun horse. His nose was bright red from the biting Texas wind. He didn't dismount when he reached the yard. He just leaned down and handed Silas a thick envelope. Heavy paper. A stiff wax seal. Silas gave the boy a nickel. He watched the kid turn the horse around and kick it into a trot back toward Oak Creek. Silas stood in the dirt. He didn't need to open the envelope to know it was bad news. Good news didn't arrive on heavy parchment. Good news didn't require a wax seal. He broke the wax with his thumb. He pulled out the folded document. It was a legal notice, drafted by a town lawyer, signed by Margaret Vance. The words were formal, stiff, but the meaning was a bullet. Margaret Vance was officially contesting the boundary lines of the Vance estate. She was laying claim to the 20 acres on the eastern edge. The creek, the water rights, the exact piece of land Thaddeus Sterling wanted for the railroad. Silas folded the paper. He didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. He just felt a cold, hollow settling in his chest. He walked into the house. The cabin was quiet. Eleanor was out in the barn, graining the horses. Silas went to the lockbox under the bed. He pulled out the old letter from William Vance, the one offering to buy the creek from his brother. Then he went to the pocket of his heavy coat. He pulled out the torn envelope from the Austin law firm, the one mentioning the $1,200. He walked to the kitchen table. He wiped the dust off the wood with his sleeve. He laid the papers down. First, the letter from her father. Next, the envelope from the Austin bank. Finally, the legal notice from Margaret Vance. 3 pieces of paper. They told a whole story. A story Eleanor had kept completely to herself. Silas pulled out a chair. He sat down. He waited. The wind rattled the window panes. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The heavy oak door creaked open. Eleanor stepped inside. She stomped the frozen mud off her boots. She unwrapped the wool scarf from her face. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold. She turned toward the kitchen. She stopped. She saw Silas sitting at the table. She saw his posture, rigid, still. Then she saw the 3 pieces of paper laid out in a neat row on the wood. The color drained from her face. She didn't run. She didn't gasp. She just stood there by the door. Sit down, Silas said. His voice wasn't angry. It was exhausted. Eleanor walked slowly to the table. She pulled out the chair opposite him. She sat. She folded her hands in her lap. Silas tapped the first letter. Your father wrote to my brother 2 years ago. He wanted to buy the eastern border, to leave it to you. He tapped the second envelope. You have $1,200 sitting in a bank in Austin. Frozen, but there. He tapped the final document. And Margaret Vance just filed a formal dispute to take the eastern border back, the land you're standing on. Silas leaned back in his chair. He looked at her. I'm going to ask you once, Eleanor, Silas said, and I expect the truth. Why are you really here? Eleanor looked at the papers. She didn't try to deny it. She didn't try to cry. She took a deep, shaky breath. When she looked up, her eyes were bright, but they were steady. My father knew he was dying, Eleanor began. Her voice was quiet in the still room. And he knew Margaret. He knew that, if he left the main estate to me, she would tie it up in probate court until I starved. The law favors the widow, not the daughter of a previous marriage. She looked down at her hands. So, he made a separate deed, a private one. He left me the small parcel on the eastern edge, the scrubland. Margaret didn't care about it, until she realized it bordered your creek. You need the water, Silas stated. It wasn't a question. Land in Texas is just dirt without water, Eleanor said. I can't build a herd. I can't plant a crop. My inheritance is completely worthless unless I have access to that creek. But my father died before he could buy it from your brother. Silas nodded slowly. The pieces were locking together. So Margaret auctioned your clothes, Silas said. She humiliated you in the town square, not just to pay a debt, but to break you, to make you leave the county before you could claim the land and fight for the water. Yes, Eleanor said softly. She wanted me to run away in shame. But you didn't run, Silas said. You saw my notice on the board. $4 a month. You took a starvation wage just so you could stay close to the property line. Just so you could keep an eye on the water while your Austin lawyers fought the probate. Yes, the word hung in the air. Heavy. Final. I didn't lie to you about who I am, Eleanor said, her voice rising slightly, searching for a defense. I didn't lie about Margaret. I didn't lie about being stripped of my dignity. No, Silas agreed. You just didn't tell me the rest. Because you were drowning, Eleanor countered. She leaned forward, the desperation finally showing in her eyes. I sat at this table on my first night here. I watched you calculate your ledgers. I saw the debt hanging over your head. You were barely keeping your own head above water. She gestured to the papers. If I had walked in here and told you I was in the middle of a vicious legal war with the richest widow in town, if I told you my land claim threatened the very water your cattle needed, would you have let me stay, or would you have sent me away to protect your own ranch? Silas looked at her. He didn't answer immediately. I was afraid, Eleanor whispered. I needed a safe harbor, and I was terrified that, if you knew the whole truth, you would throw me back to the wolves. Silas let the silence stretch. He let her words settle into the wood of the table. Then he sat forward. He placed his hands flat on either side of the papers. Eleanor, Silas said. His voice was firm, steady. He was about to lay down the hardest truth of all. I understand fear, he told her. I understand survival. But you need to understand the cost of what you did. He looked directly into her eyes. He made sure there was no room for misunderstanding. Trust is not just believing that someone won't steal from you, Silas stated clearly, ensuring the lesson was spoken aloud. True trust means having the courage to share the burden of the truth. When you hide facts out of fear of how I might react, you rob me of my right to make a choice. You treat me like an obstacle to be managed, rather than a partner to be relied on. Eleanor flinched. A small tear broke free and tracked down her dusty cheek. Silas didn't stop. The truth needed to be whole. We teach ourselves that hiding our problems protects the people around us. Silas continued, but it doesn't. Secrecy destroys the very foundation of respect. True partnership requires the absolute truth, especially when it is heavy. By hiding this from me, you didn't save us from a fight. You just guaranteed that when the fight finally arrived, We would be standing on opposite sides of the room. Eleanor closed her eyes. She reached up and wiped the tear away angrily. "You're right," she said. Her voice was cracked, broken. "You're absolutely right." She opened her eyes. She looked at the legal notice from Margaret. "We wasted 3 weeks," Eleanor said. The realization was bitter. 3 weeks living in this house, dancing around each other. If I had told you the truth on day one, we could have fought Sterling and Margaret together. We could have merged the claims. We could have, Silas agreed quietly. "But I chose fear," she said. "You did." Slowly pushed her chair back. She stood up. She looked around the small, warm kitchen. The fire was burning steadily in the hearth. The smell of coffee still lingered in the air. It had felt like home for a little while. "I broke the trust," Eleanor said. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was an acceptance of consequence. "It's cracked," Silas corrected her, "but a crack is enough to let the cold in." Eleanor nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't beg him to let her stay. She had too much pride for that. And she knew he was right. You couldn't build a future on a foundation of omissions. "I'll pack my things," she said quietly. Silas didn't stop her. He watched her walk down the short hallway to the spare room. He stayed at the table. He looked at the 3 pieces of paper. They felt heavier now. 10 minutes later, Eleanor emerged. She had her small canvas satchel. She was wearing her own clothes again, the rough grain-sack dress. She had taken off his sheepskin coat. She laid it neatly over the back of the sofa. Seeing the coat there, empty, it hit Silas harder than a physical blow. Abigail Higgins was right about one thing, Eleanor said, pausing by the door. "Staying here, now. It only complicates your fight with the bank. Margaret will use my presence here to drag your name through the mud in front of a judge." "I don't care about my name," Silas said. "I know," Eleanor replied softly. "But I care about your ranch. You need to save this place for your brother. You can't do that if you're fighting my wars too." She gripped the handle of her satchel. "I'm going into town. I'll take a room at Mrs. Davis's boarding house. I have enough coin from the wages you paid me to last a week. By then, my lawyers in Austin will have to do something." Silas stood up. "I'll hitch the wagon, drive you in." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "I'll walk. It's only 3 miles. I need the cold air to clear my head." Silas didn't push it. He knew when a person needed to walk a hard road alone. He walked over to the door. He opened it for her. The wind howled, instantly chilling the room. Eleanor stepped out onto the porch. She looked out at the rolling plains, the eastern border, the creek that had caused so much pain. She turned back to look at Silas. "Thank you, Silas Montgomery," she said, "for the coat, for the job, and for the truth." "Keep your head up, Eleanor Vance," Silas said. She nodded once. Then she turned and walked down the steps. Silas stood in the doorway. He watched her walk down the long dirt drive, a small, solitary figure against the vast, gray Texas sky. The wind whipped at her thin dress. He wanted to call out to her. He wanted to grab the coat and run after her. But he didn't. Sometimes, the hardest part of respecting a person was letting them face the consequences of their own choices. Silas watched until she disappeared over the crest of the hill. He closed the heavy oak door. He turned the iron lock. He walked back into the kitchen. The house was perfectly silent. The fire in the hearth suddenly seemed very small. Silas sat back down at the table. He gathered the 3 pieces of paper. He folded them carefully and put them in his pocket. He had $2,400 to find. He had a bank to fight. He had a winter to survive. But as he looked at the empty chair across the table, Silas realized the hardest part wasn't going to be saving the dirt. The hardest part was going to be doing it alone. 3 days. That was how long the Montgomery ranch sat in total silence. The wind still blew, the cattle still grazed, but the house felt like a tomb. Silas sat at the kitchen table. He stared at the empty chair across from him. He missed the quiet clatter of the plates. He missed the sharp, educated way Eleanor observed the world. He had asked for the truth. He had gotten it, and the truth had driven her away. A rider came on the morning of the fourth day, an express courier. He handed Silas a telegram. It was from Denver, Jake Mercer. 300 wired to the Oak Creek Bank. Repay when the spring wheat comes in. Give them hell, Silas. Silas held the yellow paper. He had the money. He could pay Thaddeus Sterling the interest. He could save the ranch. 4 years of crushing weight suddenly lifted by a single piece of paper. He should have felt victorious. He should have felt relief. He just felt hollow, because saving the dirt meant nothing if he was standing on it alone. He went to his desk. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. He dipped his pen. He didn't write a letter to Jake. He wrote a contract. Short, legal, binding. He folded the paper. He shoved it into his pocket. He grabbed his heavy sheepskin coat and walked out the door. The ride to Oak Creek was fast. The winter sun was bright, but it offered no heat. Mrs. Davis' boarding house sat at the edge of town. It was a narrow, 2-story building. The paint was peeling. The windows were small. It smelled of boiled cabbage and old lye soap. Silas tied his horse to the post. He walked up the steps. Mrs. Davis answered the door. She was a stern woman with gray hair pulled tight. She took one look at Silas and crossed her arms. She's in the back room. Top of the stairs, Mrs. Davis said. She didn't offer a greeting. The town gossip had already made its rounds. She hasn't come down for breakfast in 2 days.
Just sits in there writing letters.
Thank you, Silas said. He walked up the narrow stairs. The floorboards groaned under his boots. He found the door at the end of the hall. He knocked. Come in, Eleanor's voice called out. It sounded thin. Tired, Silas opened the door. The room was no bigger than a closet. A narrow cot, a single wash basin, a small desk shoved against a frosted window. Eleanor was sitting at the desk. She was wrapped in a thin wool blanket. The room had no fireplace. It was freezing. She turned around. She saw Silas. Her eyes widened, just for a fraction of a second. Then her face settled back into that calm, guarded mask. Silas, she'd said. You're freezing in here, Silas said. It's temporary, Eleanor replied. She set her pen down. My lawyers sent a telegram yesterday. The judge in Austin is reviewing the final affidavits. We should have a ruling by the end of the week. Silas walked into the room. He closed the door behind him. The space was incredibly tight. He looked at the stack of papers on her desk. She was fighting a war with ink and stamps, all alone in a freezing room. Why did your father do it, Eleanor? Silas asked. The separate deed. Why didn't he just leave you a share of the main estate? Eleanor looked down at her hands. She rubbed her thumbs together, trying to generate warmth. Because he loved me, she said softly. She looked up at Silas. The guarded mask finally slipped. My father knew the law, Eleanor explained. He knew that if he left me a percentage of the main ranch, Margaret would be the majority stakeholder. She would be the executor. The law would give her total control over the finances. I would be a prisoner in my own home, surviving on whatever allowance she deemed fit to give me. She took a shaky breath.
So, he carved out the creek,
She continued. He knew it was the most valuable piece of land. He gave it to me privately. He wanted me to have leverage. He wanted me to have freedom. Silas nodded. It made perfect sense. But Margaret found out. Yes, after he died, Eleanor said. The bitterness crept into her voice. She found the duplicate deed, and she realized what my father had done. He had given me the power to control the water for her entire ranch. So she tried to break you, Silas said. She didn't just want the land, Silas, Eleanor said. Her eyes were fiercely bright. She wanted to destroy my spirit. When she dragged me into the town square and auctioned my clothes, she was sending a message. She was telling me, and the whole town, that I was nothing, that without a man and without her charity, I didn't exist. She pulled the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. She wanted me to get on a stagecoach and run away in shame. She wanted me to abandon the land out of pure humiliation. Silas felt a surge of absolute fury, not at Eleanor, at Margaret, at the town, at the whole rotten system that allowed a woman to be treated like disposable property. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out the folded piece of paper. He walked over to the desk. He set it down in front of her. "What is this?" Eleanor asked. "It's a contract," Silas said. "Drafted and signed by me. Witnessed by the bank clerk downstairs just 5 minutes ago." Eleanor carefully unfolded the paper. Her eyes scanned the ink. She stopped breathing. It was a perpetual easement, a legally binding guarantee granting Eleanor Vance and all her future heirs permanent and free access to the Montgomery Creek, regardless of who owned the adjoining land. She looked up at Silas. Her hands were shaking. "Silas," she whispered, "this gives away your leverage if you ever need to sell to the railroad. This makes your land practically worthless to them. You gave me the water." "I didn't give it to you," Silas corrected her. He stood tall in the small room. He looked her directly in the eyes. He needed her to hear the lesson. He needed the world to hear it. "I am righting a wrong," Silas stated, his voice ringing with absolute moral clarity. "No human being has the right to hoard the necessities of life to control another. Water is a fundamental human right. It is the blood of the land. When we use resources to starve people into submission, we aren't practicing business. We are practicing tyranny." Eleanor stared at him. The tears finally spilled over. She didn't wipe them away. Silas pointed to the paper. "Your father tried to secure your freedom," Silas continued, stating the educational value aloud. "But true freedom cannot exist if it depends on the permission of the powerful. You have a right to that water simply because you exist, Eleanor. You are an equal on this earth. I will not let Margaret Vance, or Thaddeus Sterling, or the law itself tell you otherwise." Eleanor stood up. The blanket fell from her shoulders. She didn't care about the cold anymore. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice cracking. "After I lied to you by omission, after I broke your trust. You were surviving," Silas said, "and I was too proud to see it. Trust isn't about never making a mistake. It's about what you do to fix the cracks." He reached out. He gently took her hand. It was freezing. "Pack your bags, Eleanor," Silas said. "Silas, the town will talk," he interrupted. "Let them talk. Let them shout until their lungs give out. I don't care. You belong at the ranch. You have a winter wheat crop to manage, and I have a partner I need by my side." Eleanor looked at the contract on the desk. She looked at Silas. She didn't argue. She didn't hesitate. "I'll get my satchel," she said. The telegram arrived 4 days later. Silas was in the barn, repairing a harness, when Eleanor came running from the main house. She didn't run like a proper lady. She ran like a rancher, dirt flying. Skirts hiked up. She burst into the barn. She was breathless. Her face was radiant. She held a yellow piece of paper in the air. "Austin," she gasped. "The judge ruled in Austin." Silas dropped the harness. He wiped his hands on his denim trousers. "And Margaret S. claim is dismissed," Eleanor said, a massive, brilliant smile breaking across her face. "The judge ruled my father's private deed legally binding. The eastern 20 acres are mine, free and clear. Silas let out a loud, sudden laugh. The sound echoed in the rafters. It felt entirely foreign to his own ears. And the money? He asked. Unfrozen, Eleanor said. She stepped closer. She pulled a crisp bank draft from her apron pocket. $1,200, wired directly to the Oak Creek Bank this morning. She held the draft out to him. $400, Eleanor said firmly. That's what you need for Thaddeus Sterling. Take it. Silas looked at the paper. He shook his head. I got the loan from Jake. I have the 300. I just need a little more time for the rest. You don't need time. You need a partner, Eleanor countered. She stepped right up to him. She grabbed his hand and pressed the bank draft into his palm. We agreed. We fight this together. You gave me the water rights. You secured my future. Now, let me secure yours. Silas looked down at her. He saw the fierce, unyielding equality in her eyes. She wasn't offering charity. She was investing in their shared survival. He closed his hand around the paper. All right, Silas said. Let's go pay the devil his due. They hitched the wagon. They drove into Oak Creek. The winter sun was high and blinding. They walked into the Oak Creek Bank side by side. The bank was warm. It smelled of cigar smoke, polished mahogany, and cold, hard currency. The marble floor clicked sharply under their boots. Thaddeus Sterling was sitting behind a massive oak desk in the back office. The door was open. He looked up. He saw Silas. He smiled that thin, predatory smile. Silas, Sterling called out. Have you come to hand over the deed? You're a few days early. Silas walked into the office. Eleanor walked right beside him. Silas pulled the bank draft and his own cash from his coat pocket. He tossed the stack onto Sterling's pristine desk. $400, Silas said. The interest is paid in full. The note is current. The Continental Railroad can find another place to lay their tracks. Sterling's smile vanished. He stared at the money. He looked at the bank draft. He saw Eleanor's name on it. His face flushed red. The quiet, polite banker disappeared. The angry, cornered animal came out. You think this saves you? Sterling sneered, looking up at Silas. You just bought yourself a few months. You'll default in the spring. You don't have the capital to run that land. We have a winter wheat plan, Silas said calmly, and a combined acreage. The Montgomery Ranch isn't failing, Thaddeus. It's expanding. Sterling's eyes darted to Eleanor. The realization hit him. Margaret had lost the court case. Eleanor owned the creek. The railroad deal was dead. Sterling stood up. He leaned over the desk. He couldn't beat Silas, so he turned his venom entirely on Eleanor. You think you've won, Miss Vance? Sterling spat. You think because a judge in Austin gave you a piece of dirt, you can run a commercial ranch in my county. Eleanor didn't back down. The law says I can. The law says you own the dirt. Sterling corrected her, his voice dripping with malice. But the law also says an unmarried woman is a commercial liability. You need to move your cattle to market. You need to use the county transit roads. As the head of the County Commerce Board, I oversee those transit rights. He pointed a thick finger at her. I will deny every transit permit you file. Sterling threatened. I will blockade your cattle. I will starve your ranch until you are forced to sell that creek to me for pennies. A spinster woman without a male guarantor cannot operate a commercial enterprise in this state. You have no legal standing to fight me. Eleanor stiffened. The color drained from her cheeks. She knew the law. He was right. Coverture laws and local ordinances were designed to crush independent women. She had won the land, but the system was still built to destroy her. Silas had heard enough. He stepped directly between Eleanor and Thaddeus Sterling. Silas reached up to the collar of his coat. The heavy, fleece-lined sheepskin, the coat that had started it all in the town square. He unbuttoned it. He took it off. He turned his back on the banker. He faced Eleanor. He gently, deliberately, draped the heavy coat over her shoulders, just like he had done on that freezing morning. Eleanor looked up at him. Her breath hitched. Silas didn't drop to one knee. He didn't offer a ring. This wasn't a fairy tale. This was a war. He looked her in the eyes, and he spoke loud enough for every clerk, teller, and customer in the bank to hear. They say the law won't let you stand alone to protect what is rightfully yours, Silas said. His voice was a steady, booming thunder in the quiet bank. He stated the absolute moral truth of the story. Marriage, in this world, is too often treated as a transfer of property, Silas declared clearly. A system designed to take a woman's voice and hand it to a man. I reject that entirely. I believe a true marriage is an alliance of equals, a shield forged to protect each other from the cruelty of the world. He reached out. He took both of her hands in his. Eleanor Vance, Silas said, his eyes locked on hers. Will you marry me? Not so I can become the master of your land, not so I can manage your money, but so I can stand beside you as your equal and guarantee that this bank, this town, and this corrupt system will never again have a legal excuse to trample on your rights. Eleanor stared at him. The heavy coat rested securely on her shoulders. The warmth of his hands seeped into hers. She looked past him, shooting a defiant glare at Thaddeus Sterling. Then she looked back to the cowboy who had given her a job, a coat, and his absolute respect. A brilliant, unstoppable smile broke across her face. I will, Silas Montgomery, Eleanor stated, her voice ringing clear and strong. I choose you, as my partner, as my equal, and with all my heart. Behind them, Thaddeus Sterling sank back into his leather chair. Defeated, Silas pulled Eleanor close. He didn't kiss her for the audience. He just held her. Two people who had been broken by the world, standing shoulder to shoulder, building an unbreakable fortress out of respect, truth, and a heavy sheepskin coat. Spring arrived in Texas like a long-held breath, finally let out. The hard freeze broke, the dirt softened, and the winter wheat, the crop Eleanor had meticulously plotted out in her little leather notebook, pushed its way up toward the sun. It was a bright, stubborn green against the brown prairie. The Montgomery Vance Ranch was alive. They didn't have a big wedding in town. They didn't invite the mayor or the banker or the gossips who sat on the boardwalk. They didn't need the approval of Oak Creek to know what they meant to each other. They stood out on the eastern border, right beside the creek that had brought them together. The circuit judge rode out on a Tuesday afternoon. He read the vows from a worn leather Bible. Silas wore a clean cotton shirt. Eleanor wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself. She didn't wear a veil. She looked Silas right in the eyes when she made her promises. That was it. A signature on a piece of paper. A promise made on the dirt they had fought for. The bridge loan from Jake Mercer was paid off by early May. The heavy banknote with Thaddeus Sterling was restructured and handled with the profits from the spring cattle drive and Eleanor's unfrozen funds. Sterling didn't try to fight them anymore. He knew better. You don't pick a fight with a man who has nothing to lose, and you certainly don't pick a fight with a woman who finally has her freedom. With the crushing weight of the debt lifted, the ranch settled into a peaceful, steady rhythm. Late one afternoon, they decided to tackle the back bedroom of the cabin. It had been boarded up since Silas' brother Thomas passed away. It was a dark, dusty space, used mostly for storing broken saddles and old lengths of rope. Eleanor wanted to open it up, let the light in, turn it into an office for their ledgers. Or maybe, down the line, a nursery. Silas took a crowbar to the boarded window. The wood groaned, then snapped. Sunlight flooded the room. Millions of dust motes danced in the stale air. They started clearing out the junk. Silas grabbed a heavy, rusted iron anvil from the corner. As he lifted it, the floorboard underneath shifted. It didn't just creak, it gave way completely. Silas set the anvil down. He knelt by the hole. "Rotten wood?" Eleanor asked, coming over to stand beside him. "No," Silas said. He reached his hand into the dark space between the heavy oak joists. It was cut deliberately. Someone made a hidey hole. His fingers brushed against something cold, something metal. He pulled it out into the sunlight. It was a small, iron-banded cedar box. Not Thomas's. This one was much older. The metal was pitted. The small brass lock on the front was completely rusted through. Silas didn't need a key. He just twisted the hasp, and the brittle metal snapped in his grip. He opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in dry oilcloth, was a small leather-bound journal. The leather was cracking. Beside it lay a single faded tintype photograph. A young man in a gray uniform and a dried, pressed sprig of a purple flower. Eleanor knelt on the dusty floor next to him. She reached out and gently picked up the journal. She opened the cover. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but the elegant, sweeping handwriting was still perfectly legible. "Property of Clara Hayes," Eleanor read aloud, "May 14th, 1861. Silas looked at the date. 1861. 17 years ago, before the Montgomery family ever bought the land, before the Civil War tore the country in half. "Read it," Silas said softly. Eleanor turned the brittle pages. The entries were short, written by a woman waiting in an empty cabin on the frontier. June 1861. William left today with the Texas infantry. He built this house with his own hands. He promised he would return before the winter snow. I will keep the hearth warm. Eleanor skipped ahead. The pages were stained. Watermarks. Or maybe tears. October 1862. No word. The winter is going to be hard. I chopped the firewood myself. I look out at the creek and pray the water is making its way to him. Silas sat quietly. He listened to Eleanor's voice fill the dusty room. He looked at the tintype of the young soldier. William, a man who had stood on this exact same dirt, fought the same bitter wind, and loved a woman in this very house. Eleanor turned to the very last page in the journal. It was dated September 1863. "The letter came today," Eleanor read, her voice suddenly thick with emotion. "Gettysburg. He fell at Gettysburg. He is not coming home. My heart is buried in Pennsylvania, but I cannot bear to let this house fall to ruin. I have decided to pack my things and go back east to my sister." Eleanor paused. She took a slow, deep breath. "Before I leave," she continued reading, "I planted a lavender bush beneath the kitchen window. William always loved the smell. It is a stubborn plant. It survives the drought. I leave this book under the floorboards for whoever comes next, so that history remembers. This land was not founded on blood or money or deeds. It was built on a promise. It was built on love. May the next souls who live here find the peace that was stolen from us." Eleanor closed the book. The silence in the room was absolute. Silas felt a heavy, profound ache in his chest. He looked around the rough wooden walls. He had spent 4 years cursing this cabin, cursing the debt, cursing the unforgiving dirt. He had never once stopped to think about the ghosts who loved it first. He stood up. He offered his hand to Eleanor. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet. Silas walked out of the bedroom. He walked through the short hallway and into the kitchen. He went straight to the window over the cast-iron sink. The window he had looked out of 1,000 times, but while drinking bitter coffee in the dark, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. He looked down at the patch of dirt just outside the glass. There, pushing through the hard Texas soil, was a thick, gnarly bush. Silas had always thought it was just a stubborn weed. He had almost hacked it down with a shovel a dozen times. But today, under the warm spring sun, it was blooming. Tiny, vibrant purple flowers clustered on the woody stems. Lavender. 17 years. Through droughts, blizzards, and complete neglect, the bush had survived. It had clung to the dirt, waiting out the harsh seasons. Eleanor stepped up beside him. She looked out the window. She saw the purple blooms swaying in the breeze. She leaned her head against Silas's shoulder. "She left it for us," Eleanor whispered. Silas wrapped his arm around his wife. He pulled her close. He looked at the flowers, and he thought about a Thaddeus Sterling. He thought about Margaret Vance. He thought about the whole corrupt, arrogant world that believed a piece of paper and a bank ledger dictated a person's worth. He turned to Eleanor. He looked directly into her eyes. He needed to say it. He needed the words to exist in the air between them, solid and undeniable. "The world tries to tell us how things work, Eleanor," Silas said. His voice was steady, resonant, and clear. "They tell us that power comes from a bank vault. They tell us that land belongs to whoever holds the heaviest mortgage, or whoever the law favors on a given day." He reached up and gently brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "But they are entirely wrong," Silas continued, explicitly stating the truth they had fought so hard to learn. "The land doesn't belong to the banks, and it doesn't belong to the ink on a deed. It belongs to those who know how to sow compassion into the dirt. Love and human decency are the only things capable of surviving the harshest winters. When we treat each other as equals, when we choose to protect one another's dignity instead of hoarding our own pride, that is when we truly own our lives. No banker and no prejudiced law can ever foreclose on human respect." Eleanor smiled, the kind of smile that reached all the way to her soul. "You're a good man, Silas Montgomery," she said softly. "I'm a lucky man," he corrected her. He kissed her forehead. Then he grabbed the old tin watering can sitting by the sink. He pumped the iron handle until the fresh, clean water from their shared creek filled the can. He handed it to Eleanor. She took it, opened the heavy oak back door, and stepped out onto the porch. The spring wind caught her hair. It didn't scrape today. It felt like a blessing. Silas stood in the doorway. He watched his wife walk down the wooden steps. He watched her tilt the tin can, pouring the cool water over the roots of Clara Hayes' lavender bush. The scent of the flowers drifted up on the breeze.
Sweet.
Resilient. Victorious. Silas leaned against the doorframe. He didn't owe a dime he couldn't pay. He didn't carry a secret he couldn't share. And he didn't stand on the dirt alone. The winter was finally over. The true season of the Montgomery Ranch had just begun. This story reminds us that every human being deserves dignity, respect, and the freedom to choose their own future. If you believe stories like this still matter, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more tales from the untamed American West. This book is a work of imagination. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's creativity or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is unintentional and should not be construed as factual representation.
When the dust finally settles over the Montgomery Vance Ranch, what remains is not just the memory of a cowboy, a woman in a grain sack dress, or a battle over land and water. What remains is the deeper truth this story leaves behind. Dignity is not something the world gives us, and it is not something the world has the right to take away. Eleanor lost her home, her belongings, and her good name in the eyes of a cruel town, but she never lost herself. Silas nearly lost his ranch, his trust. This story reminds us that kindness can become the first spark of redemption. A simple coat placed over cold shoulders became more than protection from the wind. It became a promise that one human being still saw another as worthy, valuable, and equal. In a world full of judgment, greed, and silence, compassion can be the bravest act of all. It also teaches us that love is not ownership. True love does not control, silence, or rescue someone only to make them smaller. True love stands beside another person and says, "Your dreams matter. Your freedom matters. Your voice matters." Silas and Eleanor did not build their future on perfection. They built it on honesty, forgiveness, respect, and the willingness to fight together. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. No one survives the storms of life completely alone. Whether it is debt, grief, betrayal, injustice, or fear, the burden becomes lighter when shared with someone who truly cares. This tale of the Old West is really a story for every heart, a reminder to protect the vulnerable, speak the truth, forgive with wisdom, and never measure a person's worth by wealth, status, or reputation. Here on this channel, we share emotional Western stories about cowboys, frontier love, motherhood, sacrifice, compassion, and the powerful bonds between people who choose kindness in a harsh world. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. And until the next ride across the frontier, remember this. The land may remember our struggles, but the heart remembers who stood beside us when the cold wind came.